Rancher and his dog rescue stranded bride in wheelchair. Had no idea. She was worth millions. The August sun beat down on the Texas panhandle with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer, turning the air to a shimmering haze above the thirsty plains. It was the kind of heat that baked the truth right out of the land, leaving behind cracked earth and whispers. My Australian Shepherd Ranger trotted beside my dusty Ford F-250, his blue merle coat a swirl of gray and black against the bleached-out grass. His tongue lolled out, but his eyes, one a piercing ice blue and the other a deep, knowing brown, missed nothing. He was more than a dog. He was a four-legged extension of my own senses, tuned to the frequency of this ranch in a way even I, after 48 years of living on it, could never quite be. We were checking the south fence line along the old Juniper Creek bed, a place that hadn't seen more than a trickle of water since spring. The mesquite trees stood brittle and grim, their branches clawing at the empty sky. The constant low hum of the cicadas was the only sound besides the crunch of my boots on the caliche soil and Ranger's soft panting. It was a day like any other, a slow grind of work and worry that defined life out here. The cattle were getting thin, and the stock tanks were low. Every sunrise brought the same prayer for rain, a prayer that lately felt like it was getting lost on its way up. We reached the far corner of the pasture, where the Matthews Ranch bumped up against what used to be the old Langston place, now mostly fallow and owned by a holding company nobody ever saw. The boundary was marked by a line of ancient gnarled bois d'arc trees, their wood hard as iron. I checked the tension on the barbed wire, my leather gloves worn smooth from years of this same motion. Everything seemed secure. "All right, boy," I said, wiping a line of sweat from my brow with the back of my glove. "Let's head back. Got a trough pump that's making a sound I don't like." Ranger usually responded with a quick, happy bark, a sign that his work was done and a cool spot on the porch was waiting. But not today. He stood dead still, his head cocked, his ears swiveling like tiny radar dishes. He took a few steps toward the creek bed, then stopped, his body coiled tight as a spring. A low, guttural whine rumbled in his chest, a sound he reserved for things that were deeply out of place. "What is it, Rance?" I asked, my hand instinctively going to the handle of the Leatherman on my belt. "Coyote? Javelina?" He ignored me. His focus was absolute. He crept forward, his belly low to the ground, sniffing the air with an intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. He disappeared over the lip of the arroyo, and a moment later, a single soft bark echoed back. It wasn't an alarm bark, not a warning. It was a summons. It meant, "You need to see this." I sighed, the heat making me tired and irritable. The last thing I needed was to go scrambling down a rocky creek bed for a dead calf or a rattlesnake. But I trusted that dog more than I trusted most people. When Ranger insisted, you listened. I followed his tracks down the crumbling bank. The air in the creek bed was even hotter, trapped and stagnant, smelling of baked dust and dry cedar. Ranger was 50 yards down, standing beside a thicket of salt cedars that had somehow managed to keep a few green leaves. He wasn't looking at me. He was nudging something with his nose, something pale and white lying in the shade of the branches. As I got closer, my brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a woman. She was slumped in a wheelchair, the kind with thick, rugged tires meant for more than pavement. Her head was down, a curtain of blonde hair hiding her face. She was wearing a wedding dress. It was a simple, elegant thing, or it had been. Now, the white satin was smudged with dirt and torn at the hem, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the harsh landscape. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice sounding rough and loud in the silence. "Ma'am, are you all right?" There was no response. My heart hammered against my ribs. I moved closer, my boots making no sound in the soft sand. Ranger looked up at me, his mismatched eyes full of a strange, urgent gravity. And then he licked the woman's limp hand. She stirred. Her head lifted slowly, and I saw a face smudged with tears and dirt, her skin pale beneath a dusting of freckles. Her eyes were blue, but they were clouded with exhaustion and fear. She couldn't have been more than 25. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. You're on the Matthews Ranch, ma'am, about 10 miles outside of Amarillo, I said gently. My name's Cole Matthews. This here is Ranger. She looked at the dog, then back at me. A fresh wave of fear washed over her face. In this part of the world, a stranger appearing out of nowhere was rarely a good thing. I'm not going to hurt you, I said, holding my hands up in a gesture of peace. Looks like you're the one who needs help. How in the world did you end up out here? Her eyes welled up with tears. I don't know. We were driving. We had a fight. He said he was going for a walk to cool off. She gestured vaguely at the wheelchair. The battery died. I called for him. He never came back. Her groom, I presumed. Leaving his new bride, a bride in a wheelchair, stranded in the middle of the Texas scrubland on their wedding day. A cold, hard anger coiled in my gut. How long have you been out here? I asked, my voice tight. Since yesterday, she whispered. The sun went down. It got so cold. 2 days and a night, without water in this heat. It was a miracle she was still coherent. I unhooked the canteen from my belt and knelt beside her, unscrewing the cap. Here, I said, just small sips. She drank like a person who had forgotten what water felt like, her throat working convulsively. When she was done, she leaned her head back against the chair, her eyes fluttering shut. My name is Emily, she said, her voice barely audible. Well, Emily, I said, screwing the cap back on the canteen. Looks like we need to get you out of this creek bed and up to the house. That chair looks heavy. She looked down at the silent electronic controls. It is, and it's useless now. The problem was immense. My truck was half a mile away across rugged terrain. There was no way to push or carry that chair. There was only one solution, and it was one I knew she wouldn't like. I'm gonna have to carry you, I said, trying to make it sound as matter-of-fact as possible. Panic flared in her eyes again. No, I can't. Ma'am, I said, my tone firm but not unkind. Respectfully, you don't have much of a choice. You can either stay here and bake, or you can let me get you to safety. Ranger here will vouch for me. He's a fine judge of character. She looked at the dog, who whined softly and nudged her hand again as if in agreement. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sound of complete and utter surrender. Okay, she whispered. Getting her out of that chair was a delicate operation. She was light, her body frail under the satin dress, but moving her was awkward. I lifted her into my arms, the way I used to carry my own daughter when she was small and had fallen asleep in the truck on the way home from a rodeo. Emily buried her face in my shoulder, a small, choked sob escaping her. I could feel the tremor of her fear, her exhaustion, her humiliation. We'll leave the chair for now, I said, my voice a low rumble against her ear. I'll come back for it with the tractor. Let's just get you home. The walk back was brutal. The sun was relentless and every step was a chore. But Ranger trotted ahead, glancing back every few yards to make sure we were still following, his presence a silent, steady encouragement. As we crested the bank of the arroyo, the vast, unending expanse of my family's land spread out before us. The homestead was a small cluster of buildings in the distance, anchored by the tall spinning blades of the windmill, a silver sentinel against the pale blue sky. For the first time in a long time, bringing a stranger home felt like the most important work I had ever done on this ranch. I had no idea then that this young woman in my arms, this stranded bride, was about to unravel a story that had been buried in that same dry dirt for nearly 100 years, a story that would change everything. Back at the house, I settled Emily on the worn leather couch in the living room. My wife, Sarah, had passed away from cancer 5 years ago, and the house still held the quiet echo of her absence. It was clean, but cluttered, a man's home, full of books on animal husbandry, stacks of old Western Horseman magazines, and the faint, lingering scent of coffee and leather. I got her a glass of water and some saltine crackers from the pantry. She ate and drank slowly, the color gradually returning to her cheeks. Ranger lay on the cool saltillo tile at her feet, his head on his paws. watching her with an unwavering gaze as if she were a prize lamb he'd just rescued from a coyote. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," I replied, though I knew that wasn't entirely true. A lot of folks would have called the sheriff and let them handle it. But that wasn't the Matthews way. You didn't pass trouble off to someone else when it landed on your doorstep. "Is there anyone you need me to call? Your family?" "The man who—" I trailed off, not wanting to say, "left you." She shook her head, a shadow passing over her face. "No, there's no one." The finality in her tone told me not to press the issue. We sat in a heavy silence for a while. The only sounds the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the hum of the refrigerator. It was an awkwardness I wasn't used to. I was more comfortable with the silent companionship of cattle and horses. A few days passed. I retrieved her wheelchair with the front-end loader of the John Deere, and with a full charge from the generator in my workshop, it was working again. Emily was quiet and reserved, spending most of her time on the shaded porch staring out at the rolling plains. She wore clothes I'd bought for her in town, simple jeans and t-shirts that looked out of place after the tattered elegance of the wedding dress, which she'd folded carefully and placed in the guest room closet. She was healing, physically at least. But there was a deep well of sadness in her that I could see every time she thought I wasn't looking. The incident nagged at me, not just the cruelty of her abandonment, but the location, Juniper Creek. That specific spot along the old boundary line had been stirring in the back of my mind for weeks, ever since my mother had called from her retirement community in Arizona. "Cole, honey," she'd said, her voice crackling over the phone. "You simply have to do something about that attic. It's a fire hazard. Your great-grandmother Eliza's things are still up there, just boxes and boxes of them." So, one sweltering afternoon before I'd found Emily, I'd braced myself for the heat and the dust and climbed the rickety pull-down stairs. The attic was like an oven, smelling of old paper and sun-baked wood. Stacked in a corner was a heavy steamer trunk embossed with the initials EM for Eliza Matthews. Inside, beneath a pile of lace doilies and faded photographs, I'd found her diary. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with my great-grandmother's elegant looping script. I'd brought it downstairs, intending to read it, but the demands of the ranch had intervened, and it had sat on the mantelpiece forgotten. Now, seeing Emily sitting on the porch, looking out towards that same creek bed, I felt a strange pull. I retrieved the diary and settled into my worn armchair across from her. "Mind if I read?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "It's your house." I opened the book. The ink was faded to a sepia brown. Eliza had a gift for description, her words painting a vivid picture of life on this very land a century ago. She wrote of droughts and blizzards, of branding calves and losing them to sickness, of the fierce love she had for this harsh, beautiful place. And then I found an entry from the fall of 1928 that made me sit up straight. October 14th, 1928. A terrible day. Thomas Blackwell came calling again, his eyes full of greed for our water. He pressures my husband John daily, claiming the old survey is wrong, that the rights to Juniper Creek are his. But John stands firm. He gave his word to the Langstons. He holds their trust as sacred as his own name. He told me he secured their legacy for the girl, the last of their line, in the place where the lone cypress weeps for the sun. "A promise is a promise," he said, "even if the world forgets it was ever made." Blackwell. The name hit me like a physical blow. The Blackwell family still ran the ranch to the south of us, the massive B-Bar-B. The current patriarch, Jed Blackwell, was a hard, grasping man who was always pushing, always looking for an angle. Just last month, he'd sent a letter through his lawyer questioning our water rights along that same boundary, citing some obscure century-old survey. I'd dismissed it as posturing, but now... Langston. The name I'd barely registered in the diary suddenly felt important. I looked over at Emily. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. "Emily," I said, my voice low. "What was your last name? Before you got married?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. Why? Just a question. It's an old family name in these parts. She took a deep breath. It's Langston, she said quietly. My name is Emily Langston. The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't an empty silence. It was thick with the weight of 100 years of secrets. The stranded bride I'd found in the creek bed, the very creek bed my great-grandfather had sworn to protect, was a Langston. It couldn't be a coincidence. The land didn't deal in coincidences. It dealt in history and debts and promises that echoed down through generations. And Ranger, my quiet, steady dog, had led me right to the heart of it all. The next morning, the air had a different feel to it. The mystery of Emily Langston had settled over the ranch like a morning fog, obscuring the familiar landmarks of my life and revealing the faint outlines of something I didn't yet understand. Emily seemed changed too, learning that my family had known hers, that our histories were somehow intertwined, had given her a new focus. The vacant, haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a spark of curiosity, of purpose. That diary, she said over coffee at the kitchen table. Can I see it? I slid the heavy book across the worn oak. She opened it with a reverence I understood, her fingers tracing the faded script as if she could absorb the words through touch alone. Ranger lay under the table, his head resting on my boot, but I could feel the occasional thump of his tail against the floorboards. He was tuned into the shift in the atmosphere just as I was. Where the lone cypress weeps for the sun, she read aloud, her voice soft. It sounds like a riddle. My great-grandmother was a bit of a poet, I said, but my great-grandfather was a practical man. If he hid something, he'd have chosen a place that was memorable, permanent, a landmark. I thought of the landscape of the South Pasture. It was mostly mesquite and scrub, but there were landmarks. Rock formations, old windmill foundations, and a handful of stubborn, solitary trees that had survived a century of drought and wind. There's a ridge that overlooks Juniper Creek, I said, thinking aloud. A high point. There's one old cypress up there, sits all by itself. We just call it the Cypress Ridge. Emily's eyes met mine across the table, and in that moment, we became a team. The rancher and the stranded bride, bound by a story written in faded ink. Our first move, however, wasn't to go digging. Jed Blackwell's letter from his lawyer was a threat, and I needed to know what I was up against. That meant a trip into Amarillo to the Potter County Courthouse. I need to go to the records office, and I told Emily, check the deeds and surveys on that boundary line. You're welcome to come if you want. I want to, she said without hesitation. The courthouse was a grand old building downtown, but the records office was in the basement, a maze of gray metal shelves groaning under the weight of enormous dusty ledgers. The air smelled of old paper and decaying glue. We spent hours poring over documents, our fingers turning black with grime. The clerk, a woman with a formidable beehive hairdo and a bored expression, pointed us to the right section and left us to it. What we found was a mess. The original survey from 1890 clearly showed Juniper Creek and the surrounding 100 acres as part of the Langston property. But a subsequent document from 1929, filed just months after my great-grandmother's diary entry, showed the transfer of those exact water rights to the Blackwell family for the sum of $10. The signature on the deed, supposedly belonging to Emily's great-great-grandfather, was a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. He was very sick then, Emily whispered, looking at a copy of his death certificate we'd found. He died less than a week after this was supposedly signed. And $10? I snorted. Even in 1929, water rights in the Panhandle were worth a hell of a lot more than that. This stinks, Emily. It stinks to high heaven. Just as we were packing up, a familiar voice boomed across the room. Well, I'll be. Cole Matthews. Didn't figure you for a bookworm. I turned to see Jed Blackwell standing there, a smirk on his fleshy face. He was a big man who wore his Stetson indoors, a sure sign of arrogance. His eyes flickered over to Emily, a flicker of surprise followed by a cold, calculating assessment. Jed, I said, my voice flat. Just checking on some paperwork. Is that right? He ambled closer, his gaze fixed on the old plat map spread across our table. Funny, so am I. My lawyers are telling me that south boundary line of yours has been in the wrong place for about 100 years. Seems your great-granddaddy was squatting on land that belonged to my family. My great-grandfather didn't squat on anything, and, I said, my voice dangerously low, he was an honorable man. Honor don't pay the bills, Cole, and it damn sure don't fill a stock tank, Blackwell sneered. He looked at Emily again. And who's this? Your new legal expert? Before I could say something I'd regret, Emily wheeled her chair forward slightly. Her voice was steady, clear, and colder than a blue norther. My name is Emily Langston, she said. The smirk vanished from Blackwell's face. He looked like he'd been poleaxed. The name hung in the dusty air between us, a ghost he clearly recognized. He stared at her for a long moment, his mind churning. Then he gave a short, dismissive laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Langston, that name's been dead and buried in this county for 50 years, he said, but the bluster was gone from his voice. He turned and walked away without another word, his cowboy boots echoing on the concrete floor. The drive back to the ranch was quiet. The encounter with Blackwell had confirmed our suspicions. He knew. He knew the history between the families, and Emily's sudden appearance had spooked him. He's scared, Emily said, breaking the silence as we turned onto the long gravel road leading to the house. That's why he's pushing so hard now. He wants to solidify his claim before anyone can challenge it. Well, he's got a fight on his hands, I muttered. That evening, we decided to visit the one person who might remember the old stories. Not the official versions in the ledgers, but the ones told over coffee and across fence lines. Mr. Abernathy was 93 years old and lived in a small, neat house a few miles down the road. His family had ranched next to ours for as long as the Matthews had. He was sharp as a tack, though his body was frail. We found him on his porch watching the sun set. I introduced Emily, and his watery blue eyes lit up with recognition at the name Langston. Lord have mercy, he breathed, his voice a papery rustle. A Langston. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud since I was a boy. We sat with him as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and he told us the story. He spoke of the great drought of the late 20s, and of how Emily's family, the Langstons, had been hit hard. He talked about Thomas Blackwell, Jed's grandfather, a man known for his ruthlessness. Thomas Blackwell coveted that creek, Mr. Abernathy said, his gaze distant. The Langstons were land-rich but cash-poor, and Mr. Langston was sick. Blackwell saw his chance. The story always went that he strong-armed a dying man into signing away his family's future. He looked at me. But your great-grandfather, John Matthews, he was a different breed, honest to a fault. He and Mr. Langston were good friends. John swore he'd never see the Langstons done wrong. After Mr. Langston died, and his wife and daughter moved away to escape the shame and the poverty, folks around here always whispered that John had done something, that he'd hidden something for them. A last resort. A rainy day fund, you might say. Thomas Blackwell looked for it for years, tore up half that pasture, but he never found it. He died an angry, bitter man. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both tragic and hopeful. My great-grandfather hadn't been a squatter. He'd been a guardian, a keeper of a promise. When we got back to the ranch, a sense of urgency propelled us. The sky was clear, but I could smell the faint, ozonic scent of distant rain on the wind. The weather was turning. We didn't have much time. The next afternoon, with a storm building on the western horizon, we headed out to Cypress Ridge. I drove the UTV, with Emily securely beside me and Ranger standing proudly in the back, his nose to the wind. We bounced over the rough pasture, the engine whining as we climbed the long, gentle slope of the ridge. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The entire ranch spread out below us, a patchwork of gold and brown under a bruised-looking sky. And there it stood, the lone cypress, its branches twisted by a century of relentless wind, looking like it was weeping, bowing its head toward the setting sun. This is it, Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This has to be the place." I parked the UTV and Ranger jumped out before I'd even killed the engine. He didn't run or sniff around randomly. He went straight to the base of the tree, to a spot where the roots coiled out of the earth like giant sleeping snakes around a cluster of limestone rocks. He began to whine, that same low, insistent sound I'd heard in the creek bed. He pawed at the ground between two of the largest roots, then looked back at me, his eyes demanding action. I grabbed a shovel and a crowbar from the back of the UTV. The air was thick and heavy, charged with electricity. The approaching storm was sucking the breath out of the world. I wedged the crowbar under the biggest rock and threw my weight against it. It resisted, then gave way with a groan, revealing dark, packed earth beneath. I started to dig. The ground was hard, rocky, and unforgiving. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. Emily watched, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. Ranger stood guard, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the hole. After 10 minutes of back-breaking work, the shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. My heart leaped into my throat. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the dirt with my bare hands. My fingers brushed against cold, rusted iron. It was a box, a heavy metal box about the size of a small suitcase, bound with iron straps. "We found it," I breathed, looking up at Emily. Her face was a mask of disbelief and hope, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. But our moment of triumph was short-lived. Over the rumble of the distant thunder, I heard another sound, the roar of a truck engine coming up the ridge fast. A moment later, Jed Blackwell's mud-splattered Dodge Ram crested the hill and skidded to a halt. Kicking up a cloud of dust, he jumped out, his face purple with rage. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, Matthews? This is my property. You're trespassing, and you're digging for God knows what." I got to my feet, placing myself between Blackwell and the half-buried box. Ranger moved to my side, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "According to the original survey, Jed, this ridge is well within my property line, and even if it wasn't, I think this young lady has a claim to it." Blackwell's eyes darted from me to Emily, then to the box. A flash of something that looked like fear, or maybe just pure, unadulterated greed, crossed his face. "That's a damn lie. My family has paid taxes on this land for 90 years. Paying taxes on something doesn't make it yours if you stole it in the first place," Emily said, her voice ringing with a strength I'd never heard from her before. She wheeled herself forward over the bumpy ground, her eyes locking with his. "My name is Emily Langston, and I believe what's in that box belongs to my family." Blackwell took a step forward, his big hands clenched into fists. "You ain't got nothing and you ain't getting nothing. Now get off my land before I call the sheriff and have you both arrested." "Go ahead and call him Jed," I said, my hand resting on the shovel handle. "We can all wait for him right here. We can show him what we found. Let's see how your 90-year-old claim holds up against what's in this box." The wind whipped around us, pulling at our clothes and carrying the first fat drops of rain. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the sky opened up. Blackwell was trapped. He knew it. His whole life, his entire family's legacy, was built on a lie, and the proof was lying in a hole at my feet. His face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. He looked from me to the box, his mind racing, trying to find a way out, but there was no way out. The past had finally caught up to him, right here on this windswept ridge with a stubborn rancher, a determined young woman, and a loyal dog standing as witnesses. The land remembered, and it was finally ready to tell its story. The standoff on Cypress Ridge felt like it stretched for an eternity, played out against the dramatic backdrop of the breaking storm. Rain lashed down, plastering our hair to our heads and turning the dust to mud. Jed Blackwell stood there, his face a thundercloud of fury and disbelief, his bluster washed away by the sudden, undeniable reality of the metal box. He was a cornered animal, and for a second I thought he might actually try to rush me. But then Ranger took a single, deliberate step forward, the growl in his chest deepening to a sound that promised serious consequences. Blackwell's eyes flickered down to the dog, and whatever fight he had in him seemed to drain away. He knew he was beat. The truth wasn't just in the box, it was in the unwavering loyalty of my dog, in the newfound steel in Emily's spine, in the very soil of the land he'd tried to claim. Without another word, he spun on his heel, climbed back into his truck, and tore down the ridge, his tires slinging mud and rocks behind him. We watched him go until his taillights disappeared into the downpour. The tension broke. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Emily let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. I turned back to the task at hand, using the crowbar to pry the box the rest of the way out of its muddy prison. It was incredibly heavy. Together, we wrestled it into the back of the UTV. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and we were soaked to the bone, but neither of us cared. Back in the warmth and light of my kitchen, we set the box on the big oak table. It was locked, the iron hasp sealed shut by a century of rust. It took me 20 minutes with a hammer, a chisel, and a can of WD-40 to finally break the lock. The screech of protesting metal echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the heavy lid. A musty, earthy smell, the scent of time itself, rose from within. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably preserved. I carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside, stacked neatly, were documents. On top was a letter, the paper yellowed but the ink still dark and clear. It was from Emily's great-great-grandmother, Eleanor Langston, addressed to her infant daughter, Emily's great-grandmother. Emily read it aloud, her voice trembling. The letter told the whole heartbreaking story. It spoke of her husband's illness, of Thomas Blackwell's relentless cruelty, and of the secret pact made with my great-grandfather, John Matthews. The Langstons, knowing they were about to lose everything, had converted the last of their vast fortune into bearer bonds, unregistered, untraceable securities, as good as cash. They couldn't take them with them, they were fleeing with barely the clothes on their backs. So they had entrusted everything to John Matthews. He had agreed to act as a secret steward, burying the fortune and the true legal documents on his own land, which, according to the original deed also in the box, included the 100 acres and water rights Blackwell had stolen. The deed transfer Blackwell had filed was a forgery, and the original legally notarized title was right here, in our hands. My great-grandfather had kept his promise. He had guarded their legacy, passing down the secret only in the cryptic lines of his wife's diary, a clue that only someone with a reason to look would ever be able to decipher. Beneath the letter and the deed were the bonds, dozens and dozens of them, issued by railroads, steel companies, and the United States government. They were beautiful, engraved certificates that represented a fortune even in 1928. Adjusted for inflation, interest, and stock splits over nearly a century, their value was staggering. We sat there in stunned silence, staring at the proof of a stolen legacy and a hidden fortune. Emily wasn't just the heir to a small forgotten piece of Texas land. She was the heir to one of the great lost fortunes of the state. She was, without exaggeration, a multimillionaire many times over. I don't understand, she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. All my life, my family, we had nothing. My grandmother worked as a seamstress. My mother was a waitress. We always thought the Langston name was just a story of failure. It wasn't a story of failure, I said gently. It was a story of survival and of trust. Your family trusted mine, and my great-grandfather kept his word. The resolution of that night's discovery unfolded over the following weeks. We hired the best lawyer in Amarillo, a shrewd old man named Ben Carter who delighted in a good fight. When presented with the contents of the box, the original deed, the forged signature analysis, and the personal letter, Jed Blackwell's lawyers folded immediately. The Blackwells signed over the deed to the disputed land and the water rights without a single day in court. The public story was that an old surveying error had been corrected. But the whole county knew the truth. The whispers Mr. Abernathy had spoken of had finally been proven right. The Blackwells' reign, built on a foundation of theft and intimidation, was broken. They retreated into their own fences, their local power diminished, their name forever tainted. For Emily, the discovery was transformative. It wasn't just about the money, though that was life-altering. It was about the reclamation of her family's honor. It was about understanding that her lineage was one of strength and resilience, not of failure. The wheelchair, which had once seemed to define the limits of her life, now became just a part of it. Her real strength was in her spirit, in the Langston blood that flowed through her veins. She didn't run off to a life of luxury. Instead, she decided to stay. "This land is my home," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over pastures that were now, thanks to the restored water rights, beginning to show the first blush of new green after the rains. "It's the only home I've ever really had. I want to honor what your family did for mine. I want to invest here, in this ranch, in this community." And she did. She established a legal partnership with me. With her resources, we were able to upgrade the ranch's infrastructure, drilling new wells, replacing miles of old fence and buying the best breeding stock. We bought back adjacent parcels of the original Langston holdings that had been sold off over the years, expanding the ranch to its historic size. But more than that, she created the Langston Matthews Heritage Foundation, a trust dedicated to helping small family-run ranches in the area stay afloat during hard times, offering grants and legal support to protect them from predators like the Blackwells. The woman I had carried out of a dry creek bed, broken and abandoned, had become a pillar of the community, a force for good. Her bond with the land, and with my family's story, had given her a purpose far greater than she could have imagined. Our own bond grew too. It wasn't a romance, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, a partnership forged in trust and mutual respect. We were two people who had been adrift in our own ways, me in the quiet grief for my late wife, her in the trauma of her accident and betrayal. Together, guided by a story from the past, we had found a new direction. The old house was no longer quiet. It was filled with conversation, with plans, with the shared rhythms of running the ranch. One cool autumn evening, as the sky turned a soft, dusty pink, I was sitting on the porch steps, cleaning a bridle. Emily was beside me, sketching the landscape in a notebook. Ranger was lying between us, his head on my lap, his tail thumping a slow, contented rhythm against the wooden planks. I looked out over the land, my land, our land, and felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The ranch was secure. My family's honor was affirmed. And I had a partner who understood, as I did, that this life wasn't about owning the land, but about serving as its steward. I scratched Ranger behind the ears, and he leaned into my hand with a happy sigh. It all started with him. His inexplicable insistence, his deep, instinctual knowledge that something was wrong, that someone needed help in that lonely creek bed. He hadn't just found a lost person, he had unearthed a lost truth. He had brought a Langston home and, in doing so, had healed wounds a century old. Emily looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at me. "What are you thinking about?" I looked at Ranger, then out at the vast, beautiful, story-filled land stretching to the horizon. "I was just thinking," I said, "that sometimes the most valuable things aren't buried in a box. Sometimes they're walking right beside you all along." And in the quiet of that Texas evening, with my loyal dog at my side and a true partner by my shoulder, I knew my great-grandfather would be proud. The promise had been kept. The legacy was safe. The land and all its stories was finally at peace.